first, I didn't get along with Andy. He doesn't come to rehearsal. We have a guy who plays him all week. And then he comes on Friday, does the run-throughs with us, and then does the show.
In 1982, Danny DeVito stood on live TV, pressed a button, and blew up a whole TV network headquarters. It looked like pure revenge for canceling his hit show, Taxi. But behind the scenes, a real war had been going on for years. The set of this comedy show was actually a mess of angry fights, secret deals, and bosses forced to hire a ghost. Today, we're digging beneath the laughs to uncover the bizarre secrets hidden behind the scenes of Taxi. While the show followed New York cab drivers chasing their dreams, off-camera chaos often stole the spotlight, much of it caused by the unpredictable Andy Kaufman, whose behavior constantly left cast members, producers, and executives completely bewildered. 20. The imaginary parking spot. Now, before Andy Kaufman agreed to play Latka, the sweet mechanic who became one of the show's most beloved characters, he reportedly made some unusual demands. Here's the thing, Kaufman was never the type to think like everyone else. He loved keeping people guessing and had a habit of turning everyday situations into part of the show. One of the weirdest stories from the show's early days involved his famous alter ego, Tony Clifton. If you have never heard of him, Tony Clifton was a bold, rude lounge singer character that Kaufman often used in his comedy acts. But the unsettling part was that Kaufman insisted Tony Clifton was a real person and not just a character he was playing. For decades, there were claims that Andy Kaufman wanted the studio to treat Tony Clifton as a completely separate person rather than a character he played. Kaufman was famously committed to the illusion, often insisting that Clifton had his own identity and should be treated accordingly. Some even claim that Tony Clifton was given his own reserved parking space on the studio lot. Imagine studio employees setting aside a parking spot for someone who technically did not exist. This is the kind of bizarre reality that seemed to follow Andy Kaufman wherever he went, and it's exactly what made him such a fascinating character. Nobody was ever quite sure where the joke ended and reality began. This uncertainty became part of his legend and helped create the kind of behind-the-scenes stories that still have Taxi fans talking all these years later. Getting a parking space for a man who did not exist was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, Andy Kaufman kept finding new ways to make life at Taxi even more unusual. 19. Tony Danza was named Tony because he might forget his name. When Tony Danza landed his breakout role on Taxi in 1978, he was not a trained actor, but a boxer. So when he walked into the audition, nobody expected much, but something about him stood out. The original idea for his character was very different. The writers first imagined a tough Irish boxer named Phil Ryan, but after seeing Danza's audition, they changed direction completely. They rewrote the role to match him, turning Phil Ryan into an Italian character named Phil Banta. But just a few days into rehearsals, producer Ed Weinberger made another decision. The character's name was changed again, this time from Phil Banta to Tony Banta. At first, Danza thought it was a compliment. He assumed the team liked him so much that they wanted to use his real first name. But the real reason was much more practical. The producers were worried he might get confused on set. Since he had no acting experience, they did not want a situation where another actor called him Phil, and he simply did not respond in time during a take. So they made it easier for everyone and changed the name to Tony. It was a simple fix, but it stuck. Danza kept the name Tony for the entire series, and even later in his career, he kept playing characters with the same name. What started as a small safety decision ended up becoming part of his identity on screen. 18. The two-day work week. Now, Andy Kaufman was never interested in being a typical sitcom actor, and his time on Taxi reflected this. According to people connected to the production, Kaufman negotiated a very unusual arrangement that allowed him to spend far less time on set than most of his co-stars. While the rest of the cast would spend the week rehearsing scenes and attending meetings, Kaufman would usually show up only for the key production days, like table reads and the actual filming. For a network TV show, this kind of arrangement was almost unheard of. It meant the writers and producers constantly had to adjust around his availability, shaping episodes in a way that made sure his characters still fit into the story without requiring him to be there all the time. In some cases, entire storylines were even rewritten to reduce how often he appeared on screen, just to keep production moving smoothly. Behind the scenes, this somehow created tension. The rest of the cast put in long hours every week, helping to shape each episode from the ground up, while Kaufman's schedule looked completely different from everyone else's. And it did not go unnoticed. There were always rumors from the set that different rules applied to him. Some cast members reportedly felt it was unfair. Still, the producers kept condoning it, because whatever frustration it caused behind the scenes, Andy Kaufman brought something to Taxi that they simply could not replace. 17. The 15-second loop on the bridge. When you watch Taxi, one of the first things you probably remember is that yellow cab slowly moving across the Queensboro Bridge at night. It feels calm, almost like a perfect movie scene, and it instantly pulls you into New York City life in the late 70s. It looks like something the crew spent a long time filming, trying to get every detail just right. But the real story behind it is much simpler than most people think. According to behind-the-scenes accounts, the production team may not have had a lot of footage to work with. Instead of a long, carefully planned shoot, they reportedly used a short clip of the cab driving across the bridge. Then they stretched it out to match the theme music. If you pay close attention, some viewers say you can notice repeated cars and patterns in the background, almost like the same moment playing again without you realizing it. Whether that was planned or just something people noticed later is still talked about by fans. What makes this even more interesting is the time it was produced. This was long before media and digital editing. Everything had to be cut and joined together by hand using real film. So what looks like a smooth cinematic opening was actually created through simple editing tricks and smart choices, not a big, expensive shoot. 16. Tony Danza, the secret cab driver. In the early days of production, the crew went out onto the streets of New York to shoot footage for the show's opening credits. Instead of hiring a professional driver, they placed an amateur behind the wheel and filmed him driving the cab through the city. It feels carefully planned, but behind the camera, the story was a lot more spontaneous than most viewers would ever guess. The driver in that shot is actually Tony Danza. And what makes it even more interesting is that this wasn't some polished, experienced performance day. It was his very first day on the job for the series. Well, at the time, it did not feel like anything special. Just another day on set. Nobody was thinking about history or iconic TV moments. It was simply a young actor doing a simple job, still learning the ropes. But this one small decision ended up becoming something huge. Because the man driving that famous yellow cab across the Queensboro Bridge was not some polished Hollywood star. It was an amateur actor who was still trying to find his place in the industry. 15. The theme song was for a blind date. The opening scene of Taxi does not just introduce the show, it stays with you. The same thing happens with the theme song. The song is titled Angela, and it was written by jazz musician Bob James. Now, what makes it stand out is how different it sounds from most sitcom music. Instead of the regular fast beats, it is calm, soft, and emotional. It gives the show this calm, real feeling, like you are just watching ordinary people trying to make it through life in a big city. But here's the thing, Angela was never meant to be the theme song in the first place. The creators originally planned to use another Bob James track called Touchdown. It had more energy, more movement, and it was closer to what TV shows usually used at the time because it grabs attention right away. Bob James created Angela for a silent moment in an episode called Blind Date, just background music for a scene. It was never meant to represent the whole show. But everything changed during editing. When the producers heard it again, something about it just felt right. It was softer, more emotional, and it matched the mood of Taxi better than anything else they had considered. So they made a last-minute switch. They dropped the original plan and used Angela as the theme song instead. And this one decision completely changed how the show felt, turning it from a typical sitcom into something more real, more personal, and still unforgettable to this day. 14. The Harvard Graduate. When viewers first met Reverend Jim Ignatowski, he looked like the last person you would ever expect to have an impressive past. With his messy hair, worn-out denim jacket, and that permanently confused look on his face, he seemed like someone who had been drifting through life for years. Christopher Lloyd played him so naturally that most people just accepted Jim as the lovable oddball of the group, nothing more. But as Taxi went on, the writers slowly started revealing that there was a very different story underneath all of that confusion. Jim had not always been this spaced-out cab driver. He actually came from a wealthy family and was once a very bright student. The show even suggests he went to Harvard University and had a future that looked promising, stable, and full of success. He was intelligent, disciplined, and had every opportunity to build a serious career. Then everything changed after one unsettling moment in his life. According to the story, Jim was once given a brownie by his roommate without realizing it contained marijuana. That experience ended up becoming a turning point for him. From there, his life slowly shifted in a completely different direction, away from the path everyone expected and into the strange, unpredictable world he eventually ended up in. While Christopher Lloyd was turning Reverend Jim into one of the most unpredictable characters on Taxi, something similar was happening on the other side of the cast, just in a very different way. 13. The actor who tried not to get the job. Judd Hirsch was already a serious stage actor in New York. The kind of actor who took theater very seriously and did not really see himself moving into television. So when his agent first brought him Taxi, he was not exactly excited. A long-running sitcom, a network contract, a completely different lifestyle, it all felt like too much change at once. And instead of simply turning it down, he tried something a little unusual. He reportedly gave his agent a set of demands, thinking there was no way a television studio would agree to them. A higher salary, tougher conditions, things that in his mind would quietly end the conversation without him having to say no directly. It was his way of stepping out without burning the opportunity. But then something unexpected happened. The producers agreed. And just like that, the role he was trying to avoid suddenly became his. What makes it even more interesting is what came after. Hirsch did not just take the role. He became Alex Riger, the calm center of Taxi, the one character holding all the chaos together. And in the end, the role he tried hardest to avoid became the one that defined his career. 12. The audition with an insult. Now, finding Louis De Palma was one of the toughest decisions behind Taxi. The character had to be bold, rude, slightly intimidating, but still strangely funny enough that audiences would keep watching him every week. A lot of actors came through that audition room, each trying a more traditional approach, but none of them quite hit that sharp, chaotic energy the producers were looking for. Then Danny DeVito walked in, and from the very beginning, he didn't play it safe. According to those in the room, he stepped forward, dropped the script onto the table, and immediately changed the atmosphere. Before anyone could settle in, he snapped at the writers and producers with an insult that set the tone for everything that followed, reportedly shouting, "One thing I want to know before we start. Who wrote this?" At one point during the audition, he even threw in a bizarre, offbeat line in character, joking in a minister-like tone, "I assure you, I am a minister recognized by the state. Now, does anybody have a drink around here?" The room reportedly burst into laughter, not because it made logical sense, but because it perfectly captured that unpredictable, fast-talking energy Louis De Palma needed. What made it work wasn't just the shock value. It was control. DeVito wasn't lost in chaos. He was shaping it. The producers, including James L. Brooks and the writing team, could see right away that this wasn't an actor trying to read Louis. He was becoming himself in real time. In fact, by the end of the audition, there was no debate left in the room. The attitude, the timing, the fearless commitment had done its job. Danny DeVito didn't just get the role. He defined it on the spot. 11. Firing a man who didn't exist. If there was one person on Taxi who could turn an ordinary day into complete confusion, it was Andy Kaufman. At the time, the cast and crew were already used to his unpredictable behavior. But one moment that stands out on set involves a ghost, Tony Clifton. Now, Kaufman has always claimed Tony was real, and he wanted him to appear on Taxi, and eventually the producers agreed. He was cast as Louis De Palma's brother, and almost immediately, things started going off the rails. Stories from the set say Clifton showed up late, argued with crew members, ignored directions, and caused problems nearly everywhere he went. The production was becoming so difficult that the producers finally reached their limit and did the unthinkable by firing him. But here's the thing. They didn't fire Kaufman, but Tony. Which sounds ridiculous, because how do you even fire an actor that's not real? But it also goes to show how committed Kaufman was to any character he's playing. He spent so much time convincing people that Tony Clifton was a real person that the firing became one of the most famous legends connected to the show. Even after so many years, it is still remembered as one of the wildest behind-the-scenes moments in Taxi history, and a perfect example of how Andy Kaufman loved blurring the line between reality and performance. 10. The security intervention. Just when it seemed like the Tony Clifton story had finally come to an end, it took one more unsettling turn. After all the chaos, the arguments, and eventually the firing, you would think that would be the end of it. The producers had made their decision, the cast had reached their limit, and Clifton was out. Most people would have accepted it and moved on, but Tony Clifton did the exact opposite. According to one of the most famous stories connected to Taxi, studio security had to step in and escort him off the set. He didn't make it easy for anyone. As he was being led out, Clifton reportedly argued with producers and shouted at people around him. For years, people have pointed out that reporters seemed to be waiting nearby when the confrontation happened. And this immediately sparked questions. Was it a coincidence? Did someone tip them off? Or was this all part of the elaborate performance Andy Kaufman had been building around Tony Clifton from the very beginning? Well, no one can tell. Whatever it was, the incident quickly became Hollywood legend. What should have been a simple firing turned into a public spectacle. Drama with security, reporters, and enough confusion to leave people talking about it decades later. 9. The splitting personalities. It's no longer news that Andy Kaufman was not a regular actor who liked doing the same thing for very long. As much as viewers loved Latka Gravis, Kaufman was always looking for a new role to play. The problem was that Taxi already had an established character, and week after week, Latka was expected to be Latka. For most actors, that would not have been an issue, but it was obviously for Kaufman. So the writers came up with an unusual solution that resonates with Kaufman. During the third season, the show introduced a storyline in which Latka suffers a head injury and begins developing multiple personalities. And just like that, Kaufman was no longer limited to playing one character. He could become somebody completely different from one scene to the next. The most famous of these personalities was Vic Ferrari, a smooth-talking, overly confident ladies' man who was practically the opposite of the shy, awkward mechanic viewers had known from the beginning. And honestly, it was the perfect setup for someone like Kaufman. The storyline gave the writers a fresh angle, but it also gave him something he constantly seemed to be searching for: freedom. Instead of playing Latka the same way every week, he could surprise the audience, surprise the cast, and probably even surprise himself. 8. The fake language that had real rules. To most viewers, Latka's strange way of speaking sounded like complete nonsense. It felt like the kind of thing Andy Kaufman might have made up on the spot to get viewers to laugh. The words sounded random, the sentences seemed impossible to follow, and nobody watching at home was expected to understand any of it. But the weirdest part is that, as far as Kaufman was concerned, this language actually made sense. You see, long before Taxi, he had been performing his foreign man character in comedy clubs, and over the years, he developed a very specific way for the character to speak. According to people who worked with him, Kaufman did not see it as random gibberish at all. In his mind, the language had structure, patterns, and even rules. Nobody else could really speak it, but Kaufman knew when something sounded right and when it did not. This level of commitment occasionally created some unusual situations behind the scenes. There are stories that if a line did not fit the way Latka was supposed to talk, Kaufman would question it and sometimes suggest changes. Just imagine being a writer on a hit television show and suddenly finding yourself discussing the grammar of a language that did not actually exist. Then again, that was Andy Kaufman. He never treated Latka like a simple comedy character. To him, Latka was a real person with his own personality, habits, and even his own language. And somehow, this extra effort helped turn one of television's weirdest characters into one of its most believable. 7. The double cancellation survival. For a show that won awards, earned praise from critics, and built a loyal fan base, Taxi spent an awful lot of time fighting for its survival. And here's the thing: the problem was not quality, it was ratings. While critics loved the show, the audience was never quite as large as the networks wanted. So after 4 seasons, ABC made a decision that seemed to bring the journey to an end. The network canceled Taxi, and for most television shows, that would have been the final chapter. Once a network canceled a series, there was usually no coming back. But interestingly, Taxi somehow did. Almost immediately after ABC pulled the plug, NBC stepped in and picked up the show. Just like that, a series that looked finished was suddenly back in business. For the cast and crew, it must have felt like a last-second rescue. One moment, the show was gone. Next, it had been given a whole new life on a different network. Unfortunately, the comeback did not last very long. After moving to NBC, Taxi continued struggling with ratings. The network eventually gave the show a less favorable time slot, and despite the strong writing and popular characters, the numbers never improved enough. 1 year later, NBC canceled the series as well. This gave Taxi a strange place in television history. It survived one cancellation, only to be canceled again by the very network that saved it. Regardless of the show's disappointing ending, its reputation only grew over time. Today, many people remember Taxi as one of the greatest sitcoms of its era, proving that ratings and legacy are not always the same thing. 6. The blowing up of ABC. Even after Taxi left ABC, some of the people connected to the show still seem to have mixed feelings about the network's decision to cancel it. After all, the show had not only earned critics' praise, but it has won awards and built a loyal fan base during its run. Yet despite all of that success, ABC still pulled the plug. So when Danny DeVito, one of the show's biggest stars thanks to his role as Louis De Palma, hosted Saturday Night Live in 1982, he found a memorable way to revisit the subject. During one of the night's comedy sketches, DeVito appeared holding a detonator while talking about ABC. After pressing the button, viewers were shown special effects footage that appeared to show the network's headquarters exploding into a giant fireball. It was obviously a joke, and nobody was ever in any danger. But that did not make the moment any less shocking. For viewers who remembered the cancellation of Taxi, the sketch felt like a playful jab at the network that had decided the show's run was over. What made this even more memorable was how perfectly it fit the spirit of Taxi and many of the people associated with it. The series had spent years fighting for survival and had become something of an underdog story in television history. Because of that, DeVito's over-the-top joke felt less like a random joke and more like a response to a decision that many fans still disagreed with. Years later, it remains one of the most talked-about post-Taxi moments, and a reminder that the show's cancellation was not something everyone was ready to laugh off and forget. 5. The $1 Million Reruns. After being canceled by 2 different networks, most people probably assumed Taxi had reached the end of the road. Well, this is usually how television worked back then. If a show gets canceled, the final episode airs, and before long, viewers move on to something else. For a while, it looked like Taxi was heading down that same road. But that is not what happened. Instead, the show found a whole new life through reruns. Because Taxi had produced more than 100 episodes, local television stations could buy the rights and air the series on their own schedules. As a result, people who had completely missed the show during its original run suddenly had a chance to discover it. Day after day, new viewers were meeting Alex, Louis, Latka, Reverend Jim, Elaine, and the rest of the Garage crew. And the more the reruns aired, the more the audience seemed to grow. This is what makes this story so ironic. During its original run, Taxi was constantly fighting for viewers. Yet after the cameras stopped rolling, the show ended up reaching an even larger audience than before. While the networks had moved on, viewers had not. In fact, new generations kept finding the series year after year, helping turn it into one of the most beloved sitcoms of its era. So even though Taxi lost the ratings battle when it was on the air, its real success story was only just beginning. 4. The Afterlife of the Garage. For a show that spent so much time fighting to stay on the air, Taxi left behind a much bigger legacy than anyone could have expected. By the time the series ended, viewers had already fallen in love with the cast. But what nobody knew at the time was that many of those actors were about to become even bigger stars. In fact, for several members of the cast, the end of Taxi was really the start of something much bigger. Danny DeVito is probably the best example. After making audiences laugh as Louis De Palma, he went on to become a major star in movies and television. Then there was Christopher Lloyd. After playing the unforgettable Reverend Jim, he landed the role of Doc Brown in Back to the Future, one of the most popular movie series of the 1980s. And that's not all. As the years went by, more and more members of the cast found success in television, movies, and on stage, proving just how much talent had been packed into that little garage. And when you think about everything the show went through, that makes the story even more impressive. Taxi struggled with ratings, survived one cancellation, got canceled again, and dealt with more than its fair share of behind-the-scenes drama. Yet somehow, none of that stopped it from becoming one of the most loved sitcoms of its time. Decades later, people are still watching the show, still talking about the characters, and still remembering the cast that helped make Taxi something special. 3. Reverend Jim's loopy character was originally assigned to Tony. Now, Reverend Jim, one of the funniest characters on Taxi, almost didn't exist the way we know him. Early on, the writers planned for Tony Banta, the boxer played by Tony Danza, to be the confused, slightly punch-drunk character. But after Danza was cast, they realized he worked much better as a sweet, innocent young guy. The problem was that the show already had John Burns, the wide-eyed newcomer from the country. As the first season went on, the writers noticed the two characters felt too similar. So they decided to write John out of the show and bring in Christopher Lloyd's Reverend Jim instead. And just like that, the quirky, goofy traits once planned for Tony found a new home in Reverend Jim. 2. Bobby Wheeler was supposed to be black. Now here's a casting twist that could have changed Taxi forever. When the show was still in its early stages, Bobby Wheeler wasn't originally expected to be played by Jeff Conaway at all. In fact, the role was written with a black actor in mind, and actor Cleavon Little was seriously being considered for the part. At the time, the producers actually saw Jeff Conaway as a better fit for a different character, but Conaway felt strongly that Bobby was the role he wanted. So instead of accepting their first idea, he kept pushing for a chance to read for Bobby. Eventually, the producers agreed and paired him with Judd Hirsch for an audition. That reading ended up changing everything. Conaway impressed the team so much that he won the role on the spot. It's one of those little casting decisions that seemed small at the time, but ended up shaping the show viewers would come to know and love. 1. The ultimate prank that never ended. The final chapter in the story of Taxi turned out to be just as unsettling as many of the stories that unfolded behind the scenes. In May of 1984, only a year after the series ended, Andy Kaufman passed away from a rare lung cancer at the age of 35. His family, friends, and former castmates were shocked by the news. But because Kaufman had spent years fooling audiences and keeping people guessing, many fans simply could not believe it had really happened. As time went on, stories began to spread that his death had all been a trick. Fans looked back at his practical jokes, strange stunts, and unexpected performances and wondered if he was somehow still fooling everyone. There's no proof, but the rumors never completely went away. But out of all the mysteries connected to the show, one question never seems to go away. Was Andy Kaufman always one step ahead of everyone else, or was he simply one of the most unusual actors television had ever seen? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you enjoyed this video, click on the next video on your screen.